It is September 16th, 2016. We are here in Waterloo with J Troupe. Oliver, thank you very much for sitting down and talking with us. For the record, would you give us your name and would you spell it?
Oliver J Troupe, Oliver, middle initial J, Troupe.
Born when and where?
Born November 26, 1932 in Fayette County, actually Old
Okay. What did your folks do?
My folks were farmers.
Whereabouts?
They were up by Westgate at that time. They rented a farm there, and then they bought a farm in 1940, which they owned for years, and right by Orrin. It's three miles east of Orrin. And I went to a country school called Weatherby, and that very first day of school was rain, and I can remember going in a grain wagon with a binder tarp over the top. And that, my mother would sit on the bottom of that and drive the horses.
Now, did your mother do that rain or shine?
Rain or shine.
So she was the bus driver?
Bus driver. I don't think they even had a car at that time.
How many students in your school?
The high point was probably 12, and varied between 7 and 12.
And how often were you the only one in your class?
No, I always had somebody. I started out with Lila Mae Ranking was in my grade, and she's still alive. She's up in Maynard in the nursing home.
Very good. After country school, first of all, when you left country school, was there a sort of a passing out test or a test that you took when you finished to go to high school?
Not really.
Okay.
The teacher just gave a report. And we had tests at the end of the year,
Sure.
but it varied by grades and that, and varied by subject.
Did you go on to high school?
Yes, I did.
Whereabouts?
I had a choice of going to Maynard or Orrin because our farm was right on the corner of a section, and I chose to go to Orrin because I knew more kids there.
Yep.
I would have, hindsight, I wished I'd have gone to Maynard because they had wrestling and football, what we didn't have in the Orrin school. And so.
What year did you graduate from Orrin?
1951.
And how many kids were in your class?
16, 4 boys and 12 girls.
Ooh.
I was really popular. I couldn't get a date for the senior prom.
Was it that so many young men left and didn't go to high school, or was it just a rare imbalance?
That was just a rare imbalance.
Okay, yeah. Did you, when you left high school, what were your choices?
I went in the service. I stayed at farm and worked. I worked at John Deere's for about 3 months in the fall, and went into the service in January. And then when I got out of the service, I went back to John Deere's for about 3 months, and I quit that and went back to farming.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of guys who went to Deere to work. What was the appeal, and why didn't you stay?
I just didn't like being inside.
Yeah.
You know, I remember they tried to get me to change to a different department. I was in line fill, and I could fill all their stuff up in a hurry. I'd fill one pallet, and 3 guys would work on the other pallet, and I'd always beat them done. I belonged to the union. Didn't actually join, but I automatically got it as a serviceman.
Yeah.
But it was nice employment. But
tell us very quickly where you were in the service.
I went in through Camp Crowder down in Missouri, and then I was there for about a month, and then I flew out to California to Camp Roberts, and And then I qualified for officers training school, but canceled that out, so that automatically got me to Korea instead of Germany.
So you were sent to Germany?
No, I didn't get to Germany.
Oh, okay.
And I tried to re-enlist for 1 year, and my company commander thought he could get me in for 4 years. He got more credits that way, and I said no. And on the ship back, I was released from duty, just on temporary duty for about a month and a half. Okay. And so I could just go any officers club and get my dinner, or their regular dinner with soldiers, whichever I wanted to. I was just staff sergeant, sure. High rank. And I shaved all the time there, but when I got on the ship, I didn't shave all the way back. And the day before I got back, I ran into the company commander, and he says, "Oliver, you gotta clean up. You look terrible." And I says, "Because of you, I'll be a bum the rest of my life." And he was from Cedar Rapids. Never did see him again. But
so where did you end up spending your time? In California, Germany, or Japan?
Oh, most of my time was in Korea.
In Korea itself?
Yeah.
Where were you, and what year were you there?
I got there in 1953.
Okay.
It was towards fall. And then they immediately took me to a depot and took me out to a little island out of there. And being unfamiliar with the country, I couldn't figure out why everybody had their bags all up on their bunks. And I threw mine underneath the bunk and got up the next morning wading in water, and my bag was soaked in that. And we walked about a half a mile to get out of the water, and then up through the hills. Wow. And did a walk.
The armistice had been signed by that time.
Yes.
So it doesn't mean there wasn't any shooting, but...
No. We temporarily were on a PT boat taking neutral troops back to, getting them shipped back to, where was that? In Taiwan.
Okay. Very good.
And
Well,
that was interesting. Good thing they didn't know, because they had a wire cage in there, and they had somebody at each corner with a machine gun, 25 caliber machine gun. So nobody wanted to get out. Nobody wanted to shoot either, because if you shot down the side, you'd hit your buddy in the opposite corner. Real planning.
Let's talk a little bit about growing up in, you grew up in the Depression.
Yeah.
Tell us, what are your memories of the Depression?
Oh, I thought life was good. Mm-hmm. As a kid, I always had to work, feed the cows and stuff like that. And I had a little scoop, and I'd put a scoop of minerals in front of each cow and stuff like that. And by the time I was 9, I was up in the hay mow throwing hay down. And that. In fact, I was about 9 the first time I started the F-20. Yeah. I always told my dad I couldn't do it, so I didn't have to haul hay out to the cattle and unload it. But we had another farm rented a mile across through the field, and they were making hay, and my dad and Ode Ellison, who always stood in the middle of the hay rack and could reach all 4 corners, and that I talked to them and let me drive the tractor F-20 home, and they came with the team of horses and the wagon, and I caught a fence post and wrapped it around. We used railroad ties for gate posts. And I wrapped it around and killed it. Mm-hmm. So I had to start it while I was under the gun. And I didn't know enough to clean out the track that it made, and my dad sitting at the dinner table in front of Odie says, "Say, Oliver, how'd you get that tractor started?" "What do you mean get it started?" He says, "Don't lie to me. You didn't clean the marks out." So that was my first lesson. You do something wrong, cover up your tracks. But after that, then I could start the tractor.
When did you start doing field work, plowing, dragging?
I was probably about 12 when I started doing that. I can remember cultivating with that big tractor, and I had to stand up. It had a long arm. I had to stand up on it to pull that down to get it lifted up at the corner.
Yeah, yeah.
One on each side.
How many row? What, 2 row, 4 row?
2 row.
Okay.
Yeah.
Takes a long time to
Yeah.
cultivate a field.
Yeah, the Ford there,
Yeah.
when we got that just had a 2 row. But we had to set the wheels out.
Yep. The little, yeah. When you were 12, 13 during the summer, how long a day did you work? I mean, were you working 10-hour days, 2-hour days?
I would say by that time, unless I was at school, I was working the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Even at 9, I had a sled that I hauled wood in for the wood stove. Cook stove was wood, and so was the heat in that.
We should just mention, you told me before that you were the only child, and
Yeah,
so you were also the farm hand.
yeah. I enjoyed it. My dad always said, "You're going to be working most of your life. You might as well make it fun." And I've lived by that motto.
Yeah, that minus 20 and the wind's blowing. It's sort of tough to do sometimes. Yeah.
In later years, my farming operation was Moonlight Acres.
Why was it called that?
Well, always did my work at night. I worked in town for a while,
Sure.
40 years, and did the farming along with that. And I did it at night. But once in a while, I'd take vacation day, and somebody would stop and talk to me. Regular farmers have a lot of free time, and all day long I'd be over there plowing all day long. Somebody would stop and talk to me. So I couldn't get anything done before 7 o'clock, excepting before 7 o'clock in the morning and after 5 at night. Then they'd go home for supper.
They wouldn't bother you anymore.
So I rarely took a vacation day to do the farming.
How many acres were you farming at that time?
From 360 to about 580
And you were doing that by night?
by night. Yeah.
All right. So when you start the season, when it's April or March rather, I mean, do you plan your schedule out? I mean, did you know, obviously you knew when you were going to plant, you wanted to be done by a certain time.
Yeah.
How did you organize your time though?
It was easy to get it done. The regular farmers just do their work in the daytime till harvest, and
So you farmed, you said, horses to 1947,
yeah.
and it's obviously when you were still at home with your
Yeah,
folks.
I was still at home then.
Yeah. Tell us about farming with horses as opposed to the farmall.
Well, the farmall was the first tractor that we got, and that one we bought the farm over by Orne and had to break a lot of country up, rocks. Only little sections of it were farmed, and so we broke up a pasture. This Otto Sewer's son, Elmer, was older than I was, about 4 years, and he was using dynamite. And so I followed him around, and I never handled dynamite myself, but I followed him around with it and carried the crowbar, had an old axle out of a car that he'd make the holes down along the rock, and then punch the dynamite in the cap down in there, depending on what size of rock, 1 or 2 and then we'd run behind the rock that already come out, and it'd go, and then we'd go. Most of the time they came out. And
did they come out as a rock, or did they come out in pieces?
most of them came out as a rock. Once in a while, it misjudged the size of the rock and put too much dynamite, then it'd come out in pieces. Or if you get a sand rock, why, that'll bust up. But the granite rocks, those all came out in a piece.
And what would be the biggest rock that you could sort of blow out?
I would say the biggest rock that we blew out would probably, if I stood up, I could put my hands on it like that. My dad would move a lot of big rocks with the F-20. He's told me, he says, if you're ever doing this, remember one thing, kill the engine, don't push your clutch in. Because when that chain would tighten up on that back drawbar, the front end would stick right out there in front of you, up quite high in the air. And he says, if you just start your pull out and you're going in and you push your clutch in, you could keep right on going. So that's one of the first things he taught me about using that tractor, because that's the big part of what we did year in and year out.
So you were pulling him out literally with a chain and
pulling him off the farm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So some of the land after you blew the rocks out, you probably had never been plowed.
Right. Most of it where we took the rocks out. Not all. There were rocks in the part that we were farming. And that, but it was a daily job.
Now, there are some places where there are rocks at the level of the ground level. There are other rocks that are 5 foot down, so you take the ground ones out, and the one at 5 feet will work their way up to the top. Was that the way it worked?
Well, yeah, those would stay around. We had a few of those. I remember when my oldest son first got to working, we had a rock right out north of the buildings that just stuck up a little ways. And I says, you got 2 more rounds, and when you get there, watch out for that rock. And the other son and my dad were going in for dinner, and he was out there discing. That's when we had the little short 12-foot discs and that. And as he came along for that, he looked to the north, and then when the disc, then he turned around, puzzled, and looked at it, but he knew it was there. Always kidded him about that.
Yeah, those ones that only showed a couple of inches, there was a lot more below.
Yeah, but that disc could just fly, the dust would fly.
Did you, so you cleared the land, that was an annual affair sometime during the year, you were always out there?
Yeah. In fact, 2 years ago, I was still spending 90-degree temperatures picking up rocks. Got one of the rockiest farms in the country.
Wow. Okay. What was it? But was it a good yielding farm?
Yes, very good.
Okay, so it was just the added issue of keeping it workable.
Yeah. Because
today's tractors and equipment, you can't handle those rocks.
Oh, they handle them, but it's more expensive. When you break stuff, it costs more.
Costs more. Yes, it does. Tell us a little bit about horses. What kind of team or teams did you have?
He had big Belgian-sized horses, and I always had to carry a jackknife so that I could nudge them a little bit if they knew I was not my dad, and they would crowd you when you tried to get in between to put the harness on and that. And sometimes you get pinched tight enough, they wouldn't hurt you, but tight enough you couldn't move, and you had to dig your knife out of your pocket and nudge them a little bit. The thumb wouldn't do it. They were too tough for that, but little jackknife prick would. Then they flashed. Then they wouldn't bother you at that time.
So they knew it was you and not him.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. How long did it take from the time you walked out? How long did it take to get a team harnessed ready for the field?
Oh, I would say it'd probably cost me 2 hours of time to do that. My dad's comment when he bought that Ford, he says, I had to get you something. He says, you don't get to field time to come home. And that, so he had to get me something different. So that's when I got the 8-in Ford.
Let's sort of walk through, because well, you know, when you set up a team or harness a team, what do you do first?
Well, first thing, you put the collar on, then you get the harness up on your shoulders, you throw it up, and you strap up the straps underneath. You got a strap on each side, you hook down in the center, so that if they have to hold a wagon back, they got their, and then there's a strap up and a loop on it. The tongue, the yoke goes in that. It's quite a process. And as I say, I was slow.
And the harness was heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember that. I mean, you said you threw it over the horse, but yeah, you know, that was the job.
That was a job.
Yeah. Did when you what kind of bridles did you use? Was there a difference?
They had blinders on them.
Okay.
Had blinders on and a bit, and we always used a split bit. It had knuckle. A lot of people used the straight one, but my dad always believed in the other one, and that's what he always used.
When did he get rid of the horses?
Well, we probably got rid of them in '48.
Okay. Yeah.
We didn't keep them much more after we got the Ford.
Did he miss them, or did you miss them?
He missed them. Yeah. He used to have one horse that he would ride. And, we always had to keep the car out on Highway 3 mile north, but we could go right through the field. And there was a farm that had a lane, and that was always pretty good. His car always parked right by 3 when he got a car. And somebody was there, want to use the horse. My dad says, you aren't going to get over with that horse. Oh, I can ride that horse, but it wouldn't be long. He'd kind of watch. Pretty soon the horse would come running into the yard, and he'd come either walk on over or turn around and come back. You know, but
horses knew who their owners were.
yeah, they did. My dad never had any trouble with it.
Yeah. Ever have mules?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not long, but he had a couple of them around.
Yeah, mules they're strong, but they're contrary as I remember them.
Yeah. The small ones are more contrary than the crossbreeds, the big ones.
Yeah. So you got the Ford tractor, and that had a wide front end, so that was pretty easy. Yeah. And then you got the farmal. The
F-20 farmal we'd gotten first for pulling rocks and stuff like that was more restricted on what he used it for. We did have the cultivator for it, and we had a blade that we cut wood mounted on the front, run by belt. Sure. And my dad had Ode Ellison who helping him one day, and he was cutting up fence posts, oak posts, and you cut a point on the end of them, and he was cutting those, and Ode was helping him, and one slab went right down his forehead, and Ode passed out, so he loaded Ode on the back of the tractor, and then drove the tractor in just about a mile to the buildings, and my mother wound up taking him to the hospital. Ode had come to by the time he got in there, but he passed out when he saw the blood when my dad got hit.
You talked about threshing. Tell us first about the ring. Who was in the ring?
It was just different farmers right around the neighborhood that planted oats and that. Not every farmer planted oats back in that days, but if they did, they wound up shocking them and then wait a month and then let them dry out and then thrash them.
Who owned the threshing machine?
Otto Sewer owned it, the guy I really liked, and his son never spent much time with belting up the thrashing machine. I don't even remember what he was doing at that time, but I know my dad and I always had to set up the thrashing machine, and so I started out with the smaller belts and wound up putting the big ones on by the time we got everything set up.
How many belts on a thrashing machine?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I could probably figure it out, but I couldn't tell you right offhand.
It took a while.
It took better than an hour to belt it.
And how did they organize where the machine went?
Otto always arranged that, and they pretty much followed a ring so that they didn't have to double back.
Okay.
And that, so depending on who all wanted to thrash some, they'd go around with that.
And did people pay Otto with cash?
I don't know what Otto got. I never got into that, and I wasn't old enough to even pay any attention to that. I know they all worked together and that, so if somebody didn't show up unless they had a good reason, they owed that farmer work.
Right.
And they didn't do different based on the amount they had to thrash. A big bunch or small, they were close enough to the same size that they just all had to do it. And the wives cooked the meal for the days that they were there.
We have heard stories about there was always a fair competition as to how good the noon meal was.
That's a very, very true story. You could get some tremendous meals.
Yeah. Can you just remember one of the meals, what was on the table?
Oh, they always had 2 or 3 kinds of pie, and that to choose from. They had a lot of chicken. Once in a while they'd have meat, but most of the time it was chicken when you went around and fixed different ways and that. And of course, mashed potatoes, always gravy, and so a lot of vegetables right out of the garden.
Sure.
In it, so.
Did you take a break after lunch?
Yeah. In fact, I remember one year specifically, my dad made a mistake of saying, when you get done eating, why, come out, and we got to unload a wagon of grain, because we had the blower, and an hour later, he come in and he says, "You're done." The women kept giving me pie and different things, and I kept eating. I was at that age then that I wouldn't get filled. Yeah. In fact, it was pretty close to after that I had to go to the field to start pitching bundles.
Tell us about how you shocked.
Shocks, there's 9 bundles. You pick up 2 bundles, set them together, 2 on one side, 2 on the other, and then you take the one and you bend the corners over and you lay it on top so the water doesn't run down through.
So you put a cap on it.
Put a cap on them.
Did everybody put a cap on?
Not everybody, but I would say 90% of them were done.
How did you cut the oats?
We had regular binder, about 8 or 10 foot, and my dad rigged that up with a steering wheel and a rope and pulley on the clutch, and the steering wheel with a knuckle hooked into it, and he'd take the F-20. He did it with horses first, but eventually when he got the F-20, he had it hooked up for that, and he'd cut a lot of oats. And I was probably 10 or 11 the first time I did any shocking.
So let me understand. So when your father set it up that way, was he then sitting on the binder?
He sat on the binder. He was back there to see what was going on.
Right.
And I think he had a pedal. I never did it.
Sure.
But I just watched it. But I think he had a pedal that he could dump that whenever he wanted to.
In the binder, put a tie on the bundle.
Yeah, it'd tie it up, kick it out, and whenever he got 3 or 4, because they'd be spaced how thick the oats were,
Sure.
and that, and so I think you usually drop 3, sometimes 4 bundles.
And how tall was oats at that time?
Oh, I'd say the oats were probably 2.5, 3 feet tall.
Okay.
And you just pick them up by the heads. You grab the hold of the heads. You wore gloves. I tried it for a while, bare hands, but I give up with that. They get pretty sore sliding in there.
How much rain could they absorb? In other words, if you got a couple of heavy rains from the month that they were cut.
That never had anything to do with it. They dry back out of that. That's why they only put 9 together, so that they can breathe. And
so, what was the next step? You had the shock out there in the field. What happened next?
they just sat there until it cured out, and whenever they decided things were dry enough, they'd start the thrashing ring and determine where they were going first, and then just one right after another. There was no day off once they started it.
How did the shocks get into the threshing machine?
Those were always with team and wagon. Every farmer showed up with a team and wagon, and they'd go out and they'd have a couple of guys that pitched bundles on, and they'd move them around, and good guys that put the bundles on right make the work less for the farmer that hauls it in. And they fill it up they use probably about 8 foot deep, 9 foot deep. That's how much bundles are stacked up on a rack.
So I'm familiar with the hay bale rack. What did a rack for bundles look like?
Same thing. Same thing. They had a thing on the back. Most of them did. Some didn't. Just had a little low back. If they had just a little low, and they could hang that over a half a bale and get a bigger load on.
Sure.
Once in a while, depending on where the field was at, hauling them in, somebody would load them wrong, or the team would give a lunge at the wrong time, and they'd tip one over and have to reload it. They weren't happy when that happened.
Yeah. So now the team brings it into the threshing machine. What happens next?
The driver gets up on top, goes up the front ladder. Sometimes he's still riding up on top, depending on how he loads it. And he has a three-tine pitchfork, and they start up the threshing machine. Sometimes it's going because one guy isn't unloaded, the other guy pulled in, and they just continually go. One guy can throw them in faster if the other guy isn't up there ready to go. And they keep that going. When you got a dozen hay racks, why, you can keep that going pretty steady all day long.
And how fast or how slow could you throw? You threw one bundle in, you could throw the next one in right away?
You just spaced them out, one bundle right behind the other.
Okay.
You never put doubles on. You'd get hollered at if you threw.
And what happened if you put doubles on?
Oh, Otto was always standing there watching, and he'd holler.
Okay.
And if somebody did it too often, he'd have a talk with them.
And what did it do to the machine when you had doubles?
Oh, just slows it down.
Okay.
And you can plug it up, and that's a lot of work.
When you plugged it up, what did you have to do?
You had to open it up on the sides and pull stuff out and get it loose. And you can tell when you got it loose enough, it'll move just slowly, and eventually pick up speed. But if you can't get it moving slowly, and nobody ever were blamed for plugging it up twice without being in there digging themselves. They were the first guy in to dig. And that,
So could a man get in the machine itself and pull it?
yeah, there was places that you could get inside.
Okay. I didn't know that. Once the bundles went through the machine, where did the grain go? Where did the straw go?
There was a separator in the front. There was a big grinder that would take the grain off, and it'd fall down the pan, and then it would run through auger from the bottom up, and then run down into the wagon. The spout run down into the wagon. Some of them had about a 5 or 6 foot spout to run along and run down so they could space it. But they usually were about 4 to 5 foot, and that would get the center of a wagon. A wagon back right up close, and by the time that hinged out, it was in the center, and you had to use a shovel to push it forward and back in a wagon.
In the straw?
The straw went out the back, and sometimes, depending on how big a farm it was, it just went on one pile, or they had an oscillating thing so that it would go back and forth, and you'd make a longer stack.
Okay.
And some guys would get in and pack that down and try to stay out from the blower when it was coming down. But they'd wait till they get to the center, and then they run as fast as they could to get to the other side and get out of that low, because that was a dirty job.
How big were some of the straw stacks that they would make?
So I would say average stack would be about 25 to 30 feet wide, the front to back, and then probably up to 50 feet the other direction. Pretty big stack.
How high?
All those things, you could put them up probably 20 feet in the air, because that you can raise that thing up. It's flexible. It's a big round tube, about 10 inches round, and a lot of straw comes out through there, a lot of dust.
What did farmers use the straw for?
Horses mostly. But cattle could go out there too, but not as much. Mostly the horses would eat away at that. They just let them in around there. And most farmers had at least 8 horses, so they had two hitches. They could alternate back and forth if they wanted to put in enough hours in the day in the field.
So the horses would go, there was still enough grain for them to find.
Oh, yeah.
In the
Well, every farmer thrashed their own, had enough,
Okay.
their own oats in the bin.
The grain went to the horses. Did they also get grain that was left over on the stack?
Some would come through, but not very much. If the thresher was set right,
Okay.
they'd be pretty clean of that.
So what did farmers use with the straw pile? Where did that go?
That was usually just out in the cow yard someplace.
Okay.
Or sometimes they'd have a feed fence there and it'd just be on the opposite side. But they very seldom fed it to the horses through the bunk. They'd put another fence up around it, and a temporary fence, and let them get in there with that.
And so straw was bedding.
Straw was bedding. They would use that. Some put some up in the barn, depending on how much hay they had and how much room, and they'd blow it up into the barn and that, and then they would have it there, and they'd use that for bedding.
You mentioned hay earlier. You said you made loose hay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I started riding a black blind horse that knew the route and knew what was going on there, and I just sat on that horse in case they needed attention. My dad would holler if they had a problem with going up in the barn. Sometimes they had too big a load, and the horse wouldn't get it to trip into the track that goes across the top of the barn. And once it hits that, it takes off, and he's down there with a rope, and somebody up in the bend says, "Trip it," and hollers, "Trip it," and has to have a good voice. And he trips it, and if it didn't get done right, you'd hear, "Oh, oh, oh," and that. But it was a big process.
So the horse, the blind horse, was running a hay rope.
No, the blind horse was pulling up. There's a pulley.
Yeah.
It goes clear up through the center top and down to the fork, and it comes up through that pulley, back to the back of the barn, and then through another pulley out to the side, and one down, hooked down to the fence post down there, and it goes up a route, and after it trips, the horse just knew right away it'd do a turn. Always had to turn the same way,
Yeah.
and go back. Knew when it was back there and would turn. You didn't have to do anything but be with it in case something went wrong.
Now you're loading loose hay, and later I suppose you had bales.
Yeah, eventually we had bales.
Yeah. Tell us about what a grapple hook is.
A grapple hook has got chains on it, and you can set it out, and you get a whole bunch of bales in there. Otherwise, you can get 2 to 4 bales if you just stick it in with a U-hook.
Yeah.
But that big grapple hook, we did loose hay with that too.
Sure.
You could get more, and it would just, that big opening in most barns, you could just barely get it through there. Sometimes you'd have enough hay that it'd be a re-pull. Everything would tighten up and it let loose, and then it goes zip to the back of the barn when that let loose. And but it was quite a process.
What was the maximum of bales that you could handle on a grapple hook?
Oh, if you catch them deep enough, 12. That's a lot of hay.
Yeah, it's a lot of hay. That's a big load, and
Yeah.
if for some reason you don't get it plunged right when it comes down on the wagon, that's tough on the running gear.
Yeah, it's tough on everything, from the bale to,
Yeah.
yeah. You had to do it right, or you'd have a bunch of busted bales, either falling down or ripping the tine off.
Yeah.
Twine.
In the 50s, how many cuttings of alfalfa could you make? Is it the same as today?
I don't think it was any different
Okay.
than today. Usually 3. If you had a good year, 3. You always had 2 cuttings, but it depended on whether you could get a 3rd cutting or not, depending on how long you let it go. Some would cut it greener than the others.
What was a bale of hay worth in the 50s?
Oh, $1, $1.50. I can remember some as low as 50 and 60 cents in the early, when we first started doing it.
10 years ago, they were selling for?
10 years ago, well, I used to bale some back in the 70s, and I still could get up to $2 about, not much more than that.
Okay. But recently, I understand the prices jumped a lot.
The prices jumped a lot, more on that. I can remember I was making a waterway grass and farmers wanted alfalfa for their horses. And I talked one farmer into taking it, and I delivered it because I had more than I was getting rid of. And he took one pickup load. And he wanted me to take it into that little barn in his pasture where he had the horses. And the horses had it all unloaded by the time I got over the barn. I didn't have to unload it. He had to pick all the bales up. He never bought any more. His reason was they ate too much. But at first he only fed his horses alfalfa. And he couldn't find any close, and so he tried mine, but he found more alfalfa.
Well, what year did you start farming on your own?
1974.
Okay, so up until that time it was,
Just helping my dad.
okay,
I went to town in 1956,
okay, okay.
and it went to mortgage banker and then switched to savings and loan. Only worked 2 employers there.
How did you and your father work the yield, the revenue? How did you, or for that matter, how did you divide the work?
Uh, he was the boss, and I was the worker. I was young. And we got along fine, but I think my decision to go to town had more to do with it was still his farm. I would eventually take it over, and I decided I wanted to be on my own.
Sure. So when you say you went to town, what does that mean?
I went to got a job at Waterloo
Yeah.
in it, and the guy had a better qualified person than me, but I said, I'm not waiting any longer. I'm going to Cedar Rapids and look for a job if you can't make up your mind. And he decided I wanted to work bad enough that he gave me a try.
What job was that?
A mortgage banker at Wine Coupe Mortgage Company.
I don't know that. But
It was at Maid-Right on Washington Street was where the office was. They bought the old Maid-Right for an office, and I started working there.
sat behind a desk.
Sat behind a desk. The first day of work was going over to the courthouse, and I worked over there for about 10 days, taking the tax figures. All the mortgages had tax escrows,
Yes.
and they wouldn't give us the numbers. We had to go over and take them off the records. And I had a set of cards, and I went over and I put the taxes down on that. And that took about 10 days. And then I went back to the office with those, and I sat with one of the old whole rows of keys calculator, and I calculated what the monthly payment should be on the mortgages for that. And that was about a 30-day process to get those all processed. And then after that was done, then I went back to processing loans along with you. I handled all the accounting, but I had 2 girls that would run the national cash machines.
The old NCRs.
Yep.
And was it for farms only, or was it for primarily consumer loans?
Those were all houses. They weren't
Yeah.
licensed for farm loans
Okay.
and stuff like that. They didn't have any investments for those.
Okay. How long did you do that, did you say? 56?
Oh, I was with them 11 years, but I switched over to Guernsey, and Moon had a corporation that bought land contracts, and I run a little office just down the street from where that was. Little one-man, one secretary office, and I went out and bought real estate contracts, and that was on farms, hotels, what have you. I can remember him buying a motel contract down in Oskaloosa because the owner had sold it on contract and he wasn't getting the payments. And the guy kept saying the motel wasn't making any money. So contracts, you could get title to it in 30 days, went through forfeiture. So we went through that process. I took a car from Showcase. I bought a brand new car, and it didn't come in. It was a year's strike at General Motors. And so I had a loaner from Showcase, and I drove back and forth to Oskaloosa every day. And I hired a maid that worked there to run it. She increased the income so much that the previous owner bought it back and operated it himself. She made the beds up when their trucker would stop all times of the day, and she was renting those rooms out 3 times a day. And that because they sleep for 6-8 hours or whatever they had to be off and on down the road. And then she had enough people that she had a full schedule. And that, so I repossessed it for the owner, and he turned around, put it on the market, and resold it to the guy who bought it for twice the money. And that, so.
Yeah, so you worked for Max.
Yeah, I worked for Max.
Yeah, right. So while you were doing those jobs, were you still helping on the farm?
I always helped on the farm. Busy seasons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We were over there every weekend. The kids were growing up and stuff like that.
So 74 comes, what was the process of transition here?
Well, I wanted to get back to farming, and I tried to buy the Jesus Saves farm out on Independence out to the east. It had a big sign on it, and I made a full price offer, and I got turned down. I couldn't understand cash, no terms or anything like that. Full price offer, and I finally Bernie took over in Independence, not Independence, Jessup told me that there's a son out in California that's a minister. And I called him, and he said, Dad always said that if so-and-so wanted it, if he could come anywhere near an offer, and he wound up buying it $8,000 below my offer on that farm. And I guess I'm just destined not to farm. I had a battle getting financing. I had to go get my dad to co-sign with me
Sure.
to borrow the money, and I'd been doing his taxes, and I was making 4 times what best year he ever had at the farm.
So in those 50s and 60s years, what was a good profit? I mean, in terms of percentage, perhaps, or dollars, what was a good profit in the 50s and 60s on a quarter section of land?
I never knew.
Okay.
Honestly, I never paid any attention.
Okay.
I bought all new equipment, and my dad quit farming in '75. Then decided to let me. I went and bought a brand new planter, and he says, "You aren't going to last long at farming," and that. And I bought a new tractor, and then that fall, I bought a new combine, and I put a bin up over on his farm, 120 acres over there, and I had that all planted to corn. And he says, "What are you going to put in that bin?" Well, he used fertilizer in the old horse planter. He had a 4-row he pulled behind the Ford, but that's how he did it. And I broke up all the pasture and put it all into corn that year. And I had to do combine, and first he did some combining for a neighbor, and the first day he took it out to the field. Why, he went at a machine shed here with his 4x4 for his electric post, and the chicken house was on the other side, and you had 12 feet in between to go through. You could just make it through with the combine. And he'd checked everything out and put the auger out and forgot to put it back in. So I called from work to see if Dad had gone to the field with combine yet. I said, "No, he went to get parts. Well, something for the auger." Well, I knew right away what happened. So never got to the field with that combine. And but I called for a meeting in Washington, D.C., and he says, wasn't combining. I says, why aren't you combining? He says, the bin's full. And we got 2.5 bins full off of that 120 acres that year. It always had manure on it, and he put a little bit of fertilizer on, but not much. And I fertilized the whole thing commercially and got a real good yield.
When you sat down, when you were planning to take over the farm, how did you pencil out? How did you calculate what would work, particularly buying the new equipment?
Never even thought about it. I just knew in my mind what I wanted to do, and I always did everything from the seat of my pants. I never had a plan put down. Still don't, because the weather changes. I had to do budgets at work and stuff like that, and I changed through 5 different presidents at the savings and loan, and I always told them, tell me what you want and I'll put it down. You're the only one who knows what you're going to use. If I put it too high, you won't use it. I put it too low, you won't be satisfied with it. You know what's in your mind. That's wasted your money. I can be doing something more fruitful for you. Sit down and put the numbers together that you want. That's what you're going to end up with. And I managed to stay working through all of it. But,
how were those first years? 70s were good years. Yeah. How about the 80s?
80s, I went down. Mm-hmm. I kept the farm, let the machinery go, had a farm sale. Yeah. I'd build up a big line of machinery. Had the first 4-wheel drive tractor. That was when I, in the district, bought it over in Illinois. I had a 1586, which was the biggest tractor. I bought that one new. I always bought new tractors. And that tractor, we buried rocks on the new farm I got. Had somebody come in, dig holes. And then I bought a rented of 80 acres that had a ditch in it. And they got the tractor stuck many times in those rock holes, pulling the plow, bottom plow. But the farm I rented, they get stuck in the waterway, and they had to twist it around to get it out. And a little $25 bearing on the inside of an axle went out, and I found in that tractor there was 3 pumps operated from the source of oil, and they all 3 operated from that. Well, that bearing went out, I couldn't raise the plow, and I got down there and I pulled the plate off, and no oil would come out of the screen down there, filter. So I knew I had problems, so I took it into town, and it cost me $15,000 to fix it. And I couldn't borrow $15,000, so I bought I knew enough about finance. If you go for something more expensive, you're improving yourself. You're not going backwards. And so I bought the new tractor. They'd finance that for anything. And then that followed with the 80s when I had to have the sale.
Yeah. What did you do for equipment then? How did you continue to farm?
I had my friend rebidding a pickup, so I still had a pickup. I didn't realize he didn't know anything about an auction. And I thought I had gotten an extra $500 out of my pickup, but he bought my pickup back. So I had that, and I repurchased the truck I bought that I had financed that I thought went too slow. I had a Ford 600 pickup truck, grain truck, and so I found an ad in the Des Moines paper, and a guy needed a truck like that, and he went broke at farming, and so I traded the truck to him for a tractor. I had kept the A big tractor back because it didn't go for what I owed on it, and I let that go back to International, and they took that back. And it was tough times, but I never thought about committing suicide like a lot of guys did. It was just a thing that happened.
Got a tractor, got some equipment. Did you work your way out of it?
Yeah. I had that big tractor before I got it turned back in because the farm sale was in the spring. A friend of my dad's, who I'd done a lot of work for them, I had a road grader and a backhoe and all kinds of stuff with all that different farm ground. Him and a couple of other guys that had helped me out or did custom work for me went over and dissed it. And I went to the dealer for nitrogen to put on. They wanted to use the big tractor since I had it to put theirs on. And I says, okay, we'll get yours ready. I said, I don't even have a disc. So they had 5 discs over there and dissed it all. I went into the dealer and it was on Saturday to get nitrogen, and the dealer says, I can't sell you any nitrogen because when you had the sale, you were in bankruptcy. And I didn't declare bankruptcy. I had a cashier's check, and the employee couldn't sell me any nitrogen till he got in at 9 o'clock, and I had guys over there putting it on at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I called up Reedland, where I had always dealt, and told Shooty about it, and he says, get all you want. And the guy came in and found out, well, you can only have 2 tanks. And well, I need a dozen for Sunday because they're going to be putting it on Sunday. Nope, you can only have 2 tanks. Well, I'll call Shooty. And the last words to me, oh, son of a bitch, take all you want. And walked out of the office. That was my only conversation with him, and I put all my nitrogen on that weekend. The following weekend, I made arrangements and paid them a little money extra, and they took the tractor back. I assume it went back to the dealer. I don't know what the arrangement was.
What year was that?
That was 83, I think it was.
That would be sort of the peak of where things were. Mm-hmm. How many acres were you farming then?
I had 500 and some at that time.
Okay. So you got the crop in?
I got the crop in. I didn't have the money to get the weeds out of the soybeans that I planted. And a neighbor was going to combine my soybeans, but he got to doing like he always did. He did it for years when I didn't have a big combine. And he combined my corn the last year before with snow, 4 foot of snow in that. And so he hadn't got to it, and a dealer or a farmer over, big farmer over by Fairbank had 2 new combines, and he was all done. He says, Oliver, let me combine those beans for you. I says, I don't have any money to pay you till I sell them. He says, I don't care. We'll go over today. And they finished combining. I had the full 160 or 150 some acres in the beans. They did it that afternoon and finished about 5. And I had all the beans on wagons, and they had unloaded some during the day. I just unloaded my big machine shed. So I worked at about 2 o'clock, a little later than that, closer to 3. I got the wagons all dumped and in the shed. And I was walking to the house, and the radio came on, said it was raining at Fort Dodge. It had a east 25 mile an hour. So I had 1 wagon the gate wasn't shut and run a bunch of pile on the ground. I had the rubber tire on the auger and the auger out. That had about 50 bushel of beans in it. I went out and cleaned all of that stuff up and put the auger in the shed. Everything was put away. And as I was walking to the house the second time, I got halfway there and I got soaked before I got there. And it rained. And there was never a day to combine them that fall after that. After that came snow, they'd have been there all winter.
Dead loss, or almost.
Yeah. I got 51 or 52 bushel to the acre at that time, and I was real happy with that. Actually, if you want to say which year was my most profitable year, it was the year after I went broke.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have all that big equipment.
Yeah, sure.
And
you were getting people who were helping you?
Yeah. And I kept the payment up on the farm, never missed the payment. And
That was
I had papers to consolidate all my debts at farm credit, and I was reading the papers, and it had the wording in there that all the crop money went to them, and then they said, well, we'll give you money back for the farm payment. I says, I don't believe you. And I tore the papers up and left them on the desk. I was that close to being tied up in the farming so that I couldn't make the decision. And that.
So what you're saying is that farm credit would, or other
anybody that did
sure.
lending on that, that's the type of contracts
Sure.
they used.
So basically they took over the farm and you worked for them.
Right.
Yeah. You were lucky.
Yeah. If I'd have signed that paper, I'd have lost the farm.
Sure.
I still have it today, never missed a paper.
You talked about your own feelings generally in the neighborhood that you were living in. What was, how did other farmers react? Were there many farms lost?
Yeah. The farmer that didn't do my beans, he finally bought 80 acres, and he lost that. He didn't get the right attorney to help him, and he let it go.
Oh, really? Wow.
And that's what.
Got a little bit of light coming in there.
But I had a secretary at the office that was, you need to change something there?
You just stay there. I'm going to put the laptop down and the light started to reflect on
Oh.
it, so you'll just put it down a little bit.
Oh, that's fine.
You had a secretary?
I had a secretary that had one of those agreements, and they got him to give a deed to it right away, but weren't going to take possession. And they had people out looking at the house and to make an offer on the house and that, and she was just tied up on it. And so she came to work, and I says, who do you go to for an attorney? And she says, don't have an attorney. They're just taking care of it. I says, give her an attorney's name, and I says, see him. And she wound up, her son's farmer. She's deceased, but her husband's alive, and the son is farming it. They never lost an acre. The attorney worked it all out for them. They're good farmers and that, but just got caught up in it. And
how many years did it sort of take to get back to normal as far as financially?
I think because I had the farm, I got back in a normal swing of things. I only kept the farm, all the acres, rented acres, the year that happened, because I had it rented, so I had to do one more year. Then I terminated all the rented ground excepting 80 acres and just did my dad and mine. And I kept my records and I watched when I repurchased equipment and watched what I got out of it. And excepting for a road grader, I repurchased everything I had for it was cheaper than what I had in the ones I got. And I still got mostly new equipment.
Yeah. Farming's changed a lot in the 90s and early teen 20s. Have you gone over to the GPS system? I see a couple of computers behind you.
Yeah, I had a computer in my, when I got a bigger combine, used one, but it cost me $10,500 to put a computer in it. Yeah. And I enjoyed watching the yields vary in that and the moisture vary going through the field and that. I could use that, but I could never get the maps that I was supposed to. And after 2 years of using it that way, and the maps didn't cost me anything, I bought the computer from somebody else. They had the system at an elevator that came out of Illinois. I have no idea who it was, but they finally determined that when I shut the computer off, I had to do that and take the disk out of it before I shut the combine off. When I turned that key off, it erased that whole thing the way they had it hooked up in that. And nobody figured that out for 2 years. By then, I only had the combine one more year. So I had some maps, but not really what I needed because I was so discouraged with it by that point.
You said you like to watch the yield and the moisture. Does it make for a better farmer? Does it make for better yield? Yeah. Or does it make for a more enjoyable crop?
At that time, it was more enjoyable, knowing what it was doing in that. You were making decisions on bigger. The stuff that they have now is so far superior to what that was. That was just the beginning of it. Yeah. I can't tell you for sure what year that was off the top of my head now, but I had a big combine anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I keep track of the time? Good. A couple of other questions. Going back a little bit, when you were still at home with your folks, did you neighbor? Did you go up and down the road and visit people at night?
Oh yeah, every weekend, every Sunday night, you were at somebody's house. They played 500, and even when I was younger, I had to fill in at 500 when they did come out even at the tables. Otherwise, I could play with the kids and tease the girls and all of that stuff.
In addition to 500, what other things did they do?
Well, of course, in the country school, you always had parties and a box social and stuff like that. There was always something going on. We did a lot of neighboring.
Was it more than Sunday night, or was it always just a Sunday night thing?
It was more.
Okay.
You had company all the time. We'd have people stop in for her meal. My mother was a good cook, and they always knew she had enough. And they'd stop in to talk, and well, might as well have dinner or supper. Mostly dinner, but they'd do supper too.
Did you, when you, well, of course you were not on the farm up till the 70s, so neighboring had gone by then, had disappeared.
We never we'd been in town for a long time. Uh, I wouldn't say my wife was anxious about moving to the farm, even though she thought she was going to be living with a dairy farmer when we got married. It was between getting engaged and getting married that I made the decision to go to town.
Yeah.
So we were in town when we built a new house when we got married.
Yeah.
The financing back in those days, I got a GI loan, but my job was 2 years on the GI Bill, and we're a mortgage banker, and I could only qualify for a $9,700 loan, and the house cost me 10 something, and I had some loan expenses, so I went to the banker and I wanted to borrow $1,200, and he ran down a list of assets, and I said, if I had any of those assets, would I be in here asking for a loan? When he quit laughing, he reached in his desk and pulled out a note and had me sign it. Then my car went out about 6 months after that, just getting that loan and the house built. And I decided to buy a new car, and I went in, and he was up and fishing, and another guy was in there, or I had to see him for the loan for the car. I'm giving him collateral. He said, I don't know how the hell you got this loan. I kind of laughed. So I did a small loan company financing on the car for 1 year, balloon date, and they think, well, he'll renew that for the high rate later on, and we can do the rules 69, I guess it was called, where they take part of the interest and don't give it all back to you and charge you more on the same money. But I paid it off in that year's time, and that was my only small loan company financing. Other than I used to build houses, new house every other year, and
In town.
keep things rolling.
Yeah.
And that, and one time I had to borrow $500 to keep the payments because one house didn't sell. I didn't sell one before I built the other. It helped for tax breaks and that. And I never missed a payment. But as soon as I got the house sold, I paid that loan off. That was 30-some%. I wound up on that short. No collateral, just a chunk of cash from a small loan company. And I only had 2 of those lessons in my lifetime.
In the 80s, were you banking with a banker, or because you didn't, you were Farm Services, you said?
Yeah. I thought about consolidating it because I was dealing with several banks.
Okay.
In it. And they all got paid off. Not the full amount, but they wanted the money.
Yeah.
And as I could make out, do it, I'd tell them what I could do, and they'd make the decision whether they wanted to take it and release me or keep going.
And those were small banks, like in the area?
Yeah, that was small
Right.
bank area.
Yeah, those they had a different perspective.
Yeah, they were, my view of the banking system at that time, they overreacted. Some of those good farmers did not have to lose their farm. They just needed some help. But it came so fast and so hard that they overreacted. And I bet a lot of them had to go the way they went. There's no question about that. But a lot of the good farmers that had good operations and paying their bills didn't have to go down that fast.
Yeah, everybody got lumped together.
Yeah, it didn't matter which. You had to be debt free. Then you could get cash to do anything you want. They lend us half of what they would otherwise to them and let them go. Some guys made a lot of money on it, and some guys got hurt. And
What's the future of farming?
There's going to be tough times. We haven't seen anything yet. I don't know. I think these big operators will be, most of them will be able to handle it as long as they keep the government insurance. And without the government insurance, there's big troubles, just like we had before, only bigger guys.
Is the consolidation, are the big farmers the wave of the future?
Yeah, we'll never be back to seeing the individual farmers. They'll for a lot of years yet, there'll be a few hanging on and a few families. Primarily, somebody inherits a farm and they keep their skirts clean, they can go. They won't be able to go like I went back when I did. If I were to try that over again, I would go broke so quick it wouldn't even be funny. You know.
What makes a farmer get up in March and decide to farm?
That is a feeling that is inside of you, and it's going to become harder for new people to start out. I think this is just my theory. My thought is greed for money is somebody that's got $1 million that goes into farming with that and gets big, he's going for greed. Every once in a while I hear somebody say to somebody, "You got $2 million. Why in the world are you getting a job that you got to work 12 hours a day?" Well, there's a lot of time off, but there's a lot of hard days in between.
A lot of stress.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, a lot of stress. What else? What other thoughts do you have to add here? It's been a good interview.
Well, I enjoyed my farm youth and that. I had a little sled about that long, and I used that up through my teens. And that back in those days, cars were slower, and in the snow, you'd grab a hold of the bumper, and that go down the road a mile or two, let loose and walk back. I had pneumonia when I was 9 years old, and a neighbor had 4 or 5 boys, and they had a little Shetland pony, and I was unconscious with that for about 7 days, and they said if I came out of it, I could have their pony. They brought it to me when I got home. So a lot of touching things happen.
Sure.
I rode that pony to school, rode it over the snow and that, tied it by the fence and rode it home at night and that. And the country school was fun. Yeah, and that. Played baseball, Annie over the schoolhouse, what have you. But it was a good life. My dad was a principal, or whatever they called him at that time, the head of the country school. And so to get in trouble with the teacher was, it always got to my dad. He knew it before I did most of the time. I remember one time a bunch of us boys dug a hole in the ground. Somebody had a rug and put it over the top of it. We had little holes along the side of the dirt and that. And somebody, I was not a smoker, but we were in there one night after school, and all at once we thought the wind come up. The roof disappeared. The school teacher opened it, and I wasn't smoking, but a couple of boys were smoking, and So my dad knew it. I don't know how she got there before I did, but I knew he knew it by the time I got home.
Twice disciplined.
Yep.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Oliver, it's been thank you very much for sitting down and talking with us. It's been a very good interview.
it's interesting talking about it. I could talk for another day or two.
Well, we may come back and give you that chance. What you do, though, is you cover that period where you remember the Depression, you remember the 80s, you're still farming today. So, yeah, that's a long career.
I remember the cook stove when I was 4 years old at the farm my dad rented.
Yeah.
My mother was out helping shock corn, and my sister was alive. She hadn't died yet. She died from ruptured appendix. And I got up on some type of stool they had, got a can of kerosene off the top of the stove. They cut it up so and poured it on the coals, burnt my head off. So I went to the field with my hair all burned off. So I've been bald from a very young age.
Okay, I can live with that. Did you spend a lot of time helping your mom out, or were you always out in the fields?
I was always out with my dad helping. So the only thing that would be helping my mother was bringing the wood in.
Yeah, right.
And that. And later I used to pick up coal along the railroad tracks. We lived along railroad tracks. Yeah. And I'd take a little bucket and go down, and whatever size as I got older I used bigger buckets, but I'd pick up coal. And then they had coal for the cook stove. And later on we bought coal for the regular stove and put it in.
Some of those old farmhouses were cold.
Yeah. I would get out of bed and run to the barn. I had to milk at a very young age. Yeah. My dad worked with a cattle buyer. And so in the off season, we'd be down to 4 cows milking in that, and in would come a truckload. We never knew where there were going to be 1 or 2 or 10 cows to milk. So when he got down that low, I had to milk them all. He did other stuff. And we had hogs, and I used to carry the milk with 5-gallon buckets around the barn and over to the hog house. Because the processing building was on this side, the hog house was on that side, the big barn in between. And I got rid of the barn. I had a good hay crop, and I had a flat shaped auger that I ran bales up into the barn. The boys were up at high school age, and they'd stack it in there, so I didn't know what was going on. My dad got away from milking. They just went through a milk fire. They didn't stay in the barn. And he took a bunch of posts out of the barn to get the Ford in there to clean the barn out. And I didn't realize we had that much hay in there. And one Sunday morning, my mother calls me, and the barn just went down. Well, unfortunately, it shifted to the north. Okay. It broke the electricity off first as it was going over, so it had no fire. I got over there, my dad was at church, my sister, she was home. I could walk down through the yard, and I could take a chicken feather and drop it, and it'd fall right straight to the ground. There wasn't even a breeze. I couldn't say the wind hit it, too much wind, no fire. Yeah. So the neighbor came in and loaded that barn full of hay up and took it over to, I had the Waterloo farm then, and I had a big barn there, and they put it all up in the barn. That's how good neighbors are.
Yeah, you got some good breaks from neighbors. Yeah, and you in turn, I suspect, paid them back too.
Yeah, they could use any of my equipment. when I got one of my combines, I had 80 acres that I worked for a widow, and she wanted no water going off of her farm. She was mad at the neighbors that tile up to the fence, and her fence rows would get dry and that. And my dad went out to combine oats. She always had to put in 7 acres of oats or 1 field of oats. And he plugged the combine up, and I bought a new pickup with metal fenders on it and running board, the corrugated metal. And I told the boys, watch out in mud with that because you get stuck. Those don't bend. So he's going around the field with the combine and the oats, opening it up. He went clear around and nothing came out the back. He had that back end packed so tight, but he did part way around. He had to pull, he laughed because he had to pull the pickup boys out with a 4-wheel drive pickup and that. And he was the first to tell me about that, and they were the first to tell me about the combine. I almost got to the mood of burning that combine. You know, wet oat straw packed in a chopper on the back of 510 Massey combine, it takes days. I think it took me at least 5 days, possibly 6, before I got enough straw loose. I had rugs in the inside, I had bale hooks pulling from the outside to get enough straw and enough dry down to that so that I could finally, once you got a little bit loose, then it took a day to finish it out. But till you could get more than a half a dozen straws out of that thing, why, I worked and worked and worked. And then there was no, the straw was so wet, my dad borrowed the neighbor's windrower, and the roller busted out of that. And he said, take it back to him, it was no good. And I said, I'd never take anything back I borrow without fixing it. It cost me about $300 to get all that roller and stuff made, get that thing back to working order. And I fixed it and took it back to the guy. I don't think he ever used it, but it was my principle. And I dissed the field and never combined the oats. There wasn't any there.
Yeah, that's true.
in that. So it's just.
I'm going to, you just stay there. I'm going to walk in front of the camera for a second. May I lift this up here?
Yes.
And I'm going to have you hold that carefully still.
Okay.
I want to get a photo of the horses first of all.
That was the style of horses that he always had. Always had at least 6 of them, and most of the time 8 of them around.
On the other side of the, what is that over there?
I gotta look. Oh, that's the 8N40. He bought that new.
Okay, have you tip this? There we go. Hold right there. And what year was that new?
1948. I still have that. I still used it. I replaced it with DX40 diesel 4-wheel drive.
What's down below on this side?
Is that 3 kids on the
Yep.
one? Yeah. Okay, that's myself and my sister on a wagon we had.
And on the other side looks like,
Well, that was a May 31st, 1947, big snowstorm they had. And I went to work for a farmer up north of Westgate. After that picture was taken, I went up there, and it got colder than the devil. And corn was planted, and I went to work up there. And they didn't replant it until in June.
what was the day like?
The day was zero weather.
Yeah.
It really got cold. I can remember the first day I had to climb up on a windmill and hook the cable up because it never shut off. And that was the hottest day of my life. I never sweat so much in my life. I don't like heights. You know. It went from that, and that summer's work, I learned to dislike gas stoves in cold weather.
How long did it stay cold?
I say it was cold about a week before they got back to where they could replant. And he had his corn all planted, and it all froze off.
Oliver, thank you very much.
Yeah.